Good day, citizens, and good day, Thomas Jefferson, our podcast listeners. And thank you for listening.
The second installment of our Thomas Jefferson book club. The first one was on First Families, about John and Abigail Adams by our friend Joseph Ellis.
That was a tough one to beat.
And then we chose Common Sense by Thomas Paine, that pamphlet that sold over 500,000 copies and probably changed the course of human history. Amazing fellow. Jefferson and Paine were friends. And Paine nearly died during the French Revolution. He was imprisoned. I don't know if you know this story, but he was imprisoned and he was on the list of people to be beheaded.
You've told, we didn't get to that in the show.
That's an amazing
great
thing.
story with the white X on the door.
Yeah, so they're going every day. The radicals of Robespierre's faction would go into the prisons and they would take a piece of chalk and mark on the door the people that were to be taken out and beheaded that day. And Paine was very ill, near death, and he always made friends amongst the working class. He was working class. And so the jailer said, well, I know you're not going to escape. I'll open your door so you can get a little fresh air. And by opening the door, he inadvertently hid the X. If the door had been closed, the lynch mob that came in to take these people out to be beheaded would have pulled Paine, and he would have suffered under the guillotine that day. But because the door was open, they didn't see the X, and they passed him by. And then shortly thereafter, Robespierre fell, and Thomas Paine was released from prison.
It's really a fascinating book. The arguments, the structure of the book, and how he convinces the citizens of that time that now is the time, and how bad it would be to stay connected to the monarchy of Great Britain.
What's so interesting is that all of the other founding fathers, even people who didn't like Paine, acknowledged that the book went viral and it changed the course of things. And so you have to ask yourself, when does that happen in the history of a culture? That a pamphlet, Paine could not have known when he wrote this that this would have this effect.
That's a good question.
How does this happen?
Right.
It's like timing and genius, but something happens, and Paine writes this pamphlet, one of 400 during this period, and that's the one that goes viral. It does change the course of history. It makes him one of the world's most important citizens. He winds up being a part of two revolutions. First, he's part of the American Revolution. Then he goes to France, where he's made an honorary citizen of the French Republic. And here's the interesting part to me, David. When the French decided to behead Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, he argues against it and says, no, I don't. You can get rid of him without cutting their heads off.
Well, he really was a pacifist.
And a Quaker, his father Quaker, right. Mother Anglican. He did not believe in the death penalty, and he believed that Louis XVI was himself not really the problem, that monarchy was the problem, and that he and Marie Antoinette should be spared. It's an amazing story because he, in this case, as in so many others, he did things that were not going to work out for him. It would have been so much easier for him to say, I'm an American, go ahead and cut his head off if you want to.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong in calling him a pacifist, but I know that from reading about him, from what you share in the program, he was really aghast at the violence that American citizens suffered at the hands of British troops.
Well, he had just arrived. Ben Franklin invited him to emigrate. He came to the United States. He's kind of looking around for work. He's got some talents as a journalist. He works for a new magazine called the Pennsylvania Magazine. And then Lexington and Concord happened, and he has a conversion experience. He's like, okay, that does it. That we're not putting up with that.
It's a perfect lead into next week's show, too, which will be our annual 4th of July show.
And because he says there's not a direct causation, but he says in Common Sense, you know what we need now? We need some really gifted writer to produce a manifesto that will explain to the world why we're going to become independent. And so that's not what inspired Jefferson, but Jefferson then did write the manifesto.
But he must have had it in mind, don't you think?
I don't know.
Uh-huh.
A book that I want to promote here, in addition to Common Sense, and if you're a 1776 Club member, you can read or listen to David Swenson's voicing of Common Sense. But there's a beautiful biography that I really admire by John Keane, Keane, Tom Paine, A Political Life. And I've been reading it. It's outstanding. This is, You know what I thought when I started down this path is I thought I haven't read Common Sense for 20 years. That in itself is bad. And frankly, if you're alive right now, given the constitutional crisis that we're in, Common Sense is a very clarifying book. But secondly, I thought, wow, I want to know more about Paine. I want to know more about Benjamin Rush. There's all these characters that kind of float around. They're so fascinating.
It always happens that way.
Joseph Priestley, the inventor of oxygen. So Joseph Priestley, father of the Unitarian Church, he discovers oxygen. Before that, everyone thought it was just air. Yeah. This is the Enlightenment.
We talked about that. That invention of air book. That was great.
He discovers oxygen. So these are like, Paine is an inventor. He has an iron bridge. He has smokeless candles. Jefferson's an inventor.
Yeah, we need time
Benjamin
travel.
Franklin's an inventor.
Yeah.
I mean, these were like, the Enlightenment is such a great moment in human history. And I just want to say this one thing. I'm the editor of this magazine, We Proceeded On, as you know. I was on Google Images, looking around for new images of Meriwether Lewis, and I found this one, David. It's by a man named Peter Waddell. People can find it online. It's a picture of Jefferson and Lewis in the White House. And it's dated June 20th, 1803. That's the day that Jefferson gave Lewis his instructions. And Jefferson is surrounded by his world, theodolites and compasses.
I have to see this.
Gardening tools.
Yeah, could I make a request for a show? There's this magazine that you just mentioned.
We Proceeded On, which people should subscribe to.
And, summertime is the time to talk about Lewis and Clark. Could we schedule a show to talk about Lewis and Clark, that magazine, some of the articles in it, the map?
I'm going to give to our webmaster this image. We'll post it.
Right.
And then we'll do a show about what's in it, because I did all this research on this. Okay. It's fascinating.
It's a date.
Because the White House Historical Association that commissioned the painting said everything that's in it has to be authentic. You have to be able to show that Jefferson had it. And so Peter Waddell did this research with the help of Monticello and with the White House Historical Association. And there are like 30 objects that you can identify in this painting. It's like Jefferson's world.
Oh, we got to see it.
Yeah, it's cool. So that's all coming.
Let's go to the show. Oh, but before we do.
And cultural tours.
We have cultural tours to talk about. Go to jeffersonhour.com.
So the summer tour is full.
About these.
But next spring, March 3 through 9, the Steinbeck trip. Amazing trip. Then the 2 winter humanities retreats at Lochsa Lodge west of Missoula. One on Shakespeare, one on water. If you want to go on the Lewis
and Clark trip this year, you're out of luck. It's
next year.
It's booked.
And then we're going to Jefferson's France. That's back on, folks.
Great.
Jefferson in Greece. He never went. Also Shakespeare's England. So go to the website, jeffersonhour.com.
We need to revisit the book that we were so kindly sent about tours.
Oh, the tour. The book, A Guide to Thomas Jefferson's Virginia by Laura
we could spend some time talking about that as well.
And also Tim Patrick's book, Self-Evident, which he kindly sent us. And thank you very much for that generosity. So we love gifts. Send them all. Yes. Jeeps, and airplanes.
Before we go, I just want to say that if you enjoy the Thomas Jefferson Hour,
here it comes.
Please go to jeffersonhour.com to support the show. We need your support. We appreciate your support. It's very easy to do. Click on the donate button, and you can make a donation to the show to keep us on the air, or you can join the 1776 Club.
And if you do, you can listen to David Swenson voicing Common Sense.
Many other
and many
things.
more.
Yeah, don't make such a big deal out of it. I just
you
read
did.
it. Yeah, okay. But with that, we thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Listen now to this edition, Out of Character, of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, our Jefferson Book Club, the book, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Thanks for listening.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. And this week we are joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Welcome, sir.
Welcome to you. This is the Jefferson Book Club. We created it a few months ago. Our first book was Founding Family by Joseph Ellis about John and Abigail Adams, a splendid book. And the question was, what shall book number 2 be? I proposed Tacitus. You said,
Wait a minute. I just said, oh my gosh, I got a lot of reading to do.
So we went to Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which is good.
I'm sure we'll make it to Tacitus at some point or another.
But you then did this extraordinary thing, which I did not know.
I don't know that it's extraordinary.
You sat down in studio, not in the barn, but in studio, and voiced the entire pamphlet?
Well, it was raining pretty hard last weekend.
What was that like?
Interesting. In an earlier program, you talked about, I don't know if you used the word dumbing down as a phrase
I
or
have
not.
used it.
How in his time,
It was plain truth, common sense, easy prose.
right, and in our time, that's an unusual sentence structure. Boy, I haven't seen that word used very often. But it is an interesting book.
When you were reading it into a microphone, could you hear the book, or are you too busy performing the book?
Oh, no. Yeah, you hear
So
the book.
what would tell me about your own impressions of reading this book?
Whenever I do anything historical like this in nature, of course, I feel unqualified. But to read it out loud is it's a different experience than reading it to yourself. You sit down and you read the book, but when you bring the words to life in reading it out loud, it just has a much different effect on you. Does that make sense?
Of course. No, I do this quite a bit, and I have a hard time.
And you're very good at it.
You have to understand the book in order to read it, because it's easy to get it wrong, to get the cadences wrong, to emphasize the wrong word in the sentence, not to pause at the right moments. But
And I undoubtedly did at times.
well, we
I'm
all
sure.
do.
Yeah.
But you can only really read a book out loud if you also understand its contents. And so let's just outline it. It came out on January 10th, 1776. Paine was a recent convert to the American cause. He was born in England. He was a corset maker and an excise man. He was a tax collector. He had gotten himself crosswise with British authorities. He met Benjamin Franklin in 1774. Franklin was in England. Franklin liked him, admired him, and encouraged Paine to emigrate, to relocate, to leave England and to move to the United States. He did. He arrived in Philadelphia. He then went to work for a new magazine at a time when magazines were an innovation in the world, called the Pennsylvania Magazine, and he began to write. And at some point, the cause of American independence struck him, and he spent a couple of months writing out a draft of a pamphlet which was meant to persuade the American people that we just had to do it, that there was no reconciliation, that the time had come and we must not miss the opportunity to declare independence. And he wrote this. He showed it to Franklin. He showed it to several other people. One of those people was Dr. Benjamin Rush. And Rush said, I don't think you should call it plain truth. I think you should call it common sense. And so Paine agreed. And here's what's so interesting to me about it. He published it, but he refused to take revenue from it. He said that the revenues would go to buy mittens and other winter clothing for our troops. And he's one of those extremely high-minded people, they're very rare in the world, who Bertrand Russell was another one. He had the chance to be rich and he refused because he believed that there was something corrupting about being rich and that his purposes should not be tied to money. And so Paine refused to take proceeds from this book. It sold 150,000 copies within weeks, and eventually it sold about 500,000 copies. It was translated into German and French, and it was one of the world's first great bestsellers.
I read somewhere, I don't know if how accurate it is, but if you translated those numbers into today's numbers, it would be over 6.5 million copies sold.
And in his own time, if you sell 500,000 books, you should be able to retire.
Right.
But he didn't. He didn't take any of this cash.
He bought mittens.
And he let publishers take the money, and there were not adequate copyright laws, so the book was reprinted all over the United States and the world without any attribution at times, and certainly without any emoluments. But my point is that this book was one, I think I just read today that there were 400 pamphlets about this independence and sovereignty and our quarrel with Britain published in the 18 months around this. 400 other pamphlets. One and only one burst onto the world and became one of the world's most important books, and that's Common Sense. And so the question you have is why? There were other people making these arguments. Is it because of the timing? Is it because of his unique prose style? What enabled Common Sense to go viral when most things don't?
I think he made an excellent argument.
What's the argument in short?
There are to me, there's two central
Okay, let's hear
things.
your
And
two.
that is that a hereditary monarchy is inherently corrupt. In other words, the British system is something we can no longer tolerate.
First section is on monarchy, and he says it's absurd. No rational being would do it. There's no defense of monarchy, especially hereditary monarchy. It's a historical accident, and we should break ourselves from that whole world of monarchy, and especially hereditary monarchy, once and for all. That's the first argument.
The second takeaway is that he makes the case that the time is right for America to break bonds with Britain and declare her independence.
You know what struck me so there are these sections, and the second section is about the timing, and we have to do it now. But he says, really, you want to reconcile? They sent troops. They stirred up slave insurrections. They've convinced the native peoples of the West to attack our border settlements. They've burned towns. They've killed American citizens. You really want to reconcile with these people? I mean, they're terrorizing us. We can't reconcile with them.
The other thing I kind of took away from it is he almost made it as if it was a sermon being given. Parts in chapter 2 that are, I don't know if you want to say anti-Semitic, but borderline. But he does, he makes all these biblical references and.
Well, he shows that there's no biblical basis for monarchy. Very interestingly, he says, look. When the Israelites wanted kings, their prophet said, don't do it. It's a bad idea. God's the only king. Humans should govern themselves.
Don't you think that had some attraction to citizens of the time? This sort of drawing
people.
It did.
Because there were books written. There's one called Patriarchia that was written in the Renaissance in the 17th century that said that kingship is the natural form of government, just as the father is the center of
say that
called Patriarchia.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, Filmer. And its argument is that just as the father should be the patriarch of the family, so too there should be a patriarch of the culture, that this is God's will, and that so kingship is not an artificial form. It's inevitable, and it's right. It's natural. And Paine's view is no. It's not right. It's not natural. It's artificial. And he's very Jeffersonian in many respects, or Jefferson is very Paine-like. He says, it might be one thing to make David Swenson the king if you're unscrupulous or lucky or powerful or maybe wise, but what makes you think that your children and grandchildren deserve to be kings? That the idea of hereditary monarchy is just, on the face of things, moronic and absurd. That's a very convincing argument, and Jefferson followed it. He once said to Hamilton, before we have hereditary monarchy, should we try a chair of hereditary calculus? And so of course
really?
not. Yeah.
I've never heard that.
He says, let's try a hereditary mathematics, see how that works out.
That's a great argument.
So it is a great argument that the argument for hereditary monarchy, which was put forward by Alexander Hamilton, is that it's stable. So George II may be a good king, George III may be a weak king, but at least there's no succession crisis. There's no legitimacy crisis. But Paine shows that's not true. He says in the history of the British monarchy from the time of William the Conqueror, and he has the X number of rebellions and Y number of civil wars, and he says it's not a smooth transition at all. It's attended with chaos. So don't argue that it's a more stable form of government. It isn't, and it's absurd on the face.
You talked earlier about when Thomas Paine arrived in America, how Franklin had something to do with him coming in. So he got here in November 1774, and that was like right before the battles of Lexington and Concord. My impression is that had a pretty big effect on him.
The violence. He said, people in America think, we'll work this out, we'll reconcile. But he said, don't call it your mother country. Your mother country sends troops, including foreign mercenaries, to kill you in the streets. That's not natural. You can't reconcile after that. That's not like a dispute in Parliament where you shout at each other, but then you go have supper together or you agree to disagree. He's saying they're waging war against America. They've sent the largest body of troops in the history of the Atlantic to put down a rebellion. George III has denounced the American rebels in Parliament. There are bills of attainder and proscription lists for people like Jefferson and Washington and others. There's no reconciliation possible. You cannot work this out. And he says, independence is going to come one way or the other. The American resource base, the huge geographic land base, and the population increase are such that it's inevitable that at some point America's not going to be part of Britain anymore. And so the time has come. That's your timing argument. Let's get it over with. If we miss this, we're not only ducking this thing that we're going to have to do at some point anyway, but we're betraying the human project because we are vindicating the idea of the dignity of man and the freedom and equality of man. And if we fail at this, we become part of the problem. So now is the time. There's an urgent sermonic feel to it that we mustn't duck this opportunity that has been forced upon us by a bad king, a bad ministry, and a bad parliament.
But he also wasn't real impressed with the American public. 2 years after the publication of Common Sense, he wrote that the American public might have found they might have been led by a thread and governed by a reed. Their attachment to Britain was obstinate.
And Jefferson notices that too, that at any given moment, if there had been a plebiscite, the American people would probably have wanted to stay under the British crown.
Where does that come from?
Jefferson talks about this and says that the people were conservative. They didn't like this change. They liked being British citizens, but they were tired of being mistreated.
Wow, so much for majority rule, Mr. Jefferson.
No, Jefferson admitted that the revolution was done by a junta of very smart revolutionary characters.
We've got to talk about that. Right now we need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Seated across from me this week is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson.
We're in studio because this is the second installment of the Thomas Jefferson Book Club.
Where better to be?
Well, you don't want to be in the barn.
Well, not with all these books in front of us.
You don't want that kind of stale manure smell in your library.
So before we took this break, you had said that Jefferson kind of knew this wasn't the majority that wanted. The majority of American citizens wanted to find a way to reconcile with Britain, and in fact, Common Sense deals with that throughout.
Well, Jefferson understood that it's hard to do what we did in 1776, that people are essentially conservative. And remember, in the Declaration, he says, we do not want to do this for light and transient causes. Mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing their former systems of government. He says, look, none of us really wanted this. There might have been a few hotheads who wanted this, but we didn't really want this. But it's been forced upon us. And now that it's been forced upon us, we're going to do it. But Jefferson understood that the great majority of the American people just wanted to be left alone. They wanted to be untaxed or lightly taxed. They wanted representation. They didn't want to be taxed without their consent. They didn't like some of the things that Great Britain was doing, but they didn't really get upset in a big way until after the British closed the port of Boston following the Boston Tea Party, and then sent troops and burned Norfolk, for example. The British came and burned Norfolk to the ground and, killed people. And I read Joseph Ellis's book, as you did, about the summer of 1776, and he talks about how the Hessian mercenaries bayoneted the people they wounded. So they'd shoot a bunch of American colonists, and then they'd go and kill them. They'd bayonet them. This was not like, okay, we've wounded you, you're now our prisoners, we'll release you at a certain point. And the sense one gets is that the British were way too forceful in the violence with which they tried to put down the rebellion. And if they hadn't done that, Paine says we might not have wanted independence. It was the violence of the parent to the child that forced us to swallow hard and declare independency. And Jefferson is of much the same point of view, David. He wrote a letter to another John Randolph, not our John Randolph, who had moved to England, a loyalist, and he said, look, nobody, and this is, of course, so Jeffersonian, nobody wishes more than I do to reconcile. He said, but there's one thing that I hate more than rebellion, and that is being enslaved by the British ministry. So we don't want to rebel, but we have to, because the only thing that's worse than that is the way Britain has systematically treated us, and we can't be human beings and hold our heads up if we put up with that. And so Jefferson understood that the American people were not really ripe for revolution, and John Adams understood it too. And his deepest frustration in the Second Continental Congress is he couldn't even get the other members of the of the Congress to agree to independence. They were like, well, maybe we can work it out. Let's go back to our home constituencies. We better write back for advice. And Adams' view was, look, folks, there's no return. There's no going back. You've got to have the moral courage to do this. But it took more than just the circumstances. It took propaganda. And whatever else you call common sense, it is a propaganda piece. And Paine knew that it was a propaganda piece. He was trying to convince the American people to take this grave step. And he used all of the tricks that a master pamphleteer can use. He called George III the royal brute of England, and he uses ridicule and sarcasm. And then he has these inspiring passages in which he says, the American cause is the cause of all mankind.
Right.
You know, where it's like, you're not just some guy from Virginia.
Yeah.
You're not just some merchant from Boston. This is the cause of humankind.
I think that comes from the introduction.
It does.
That's if you want to try reading it out loud, read the introduction. It's not long, and it's wonderful because he makes those arguments, and then in the end he says, these are what citizens should be like, and I am one. And I think I don't know if you mentioned or not that earlier that when we were talking about his difficulties with publishers and things, he
quarreled with everybody.
He wanted to be anonymous.
He did.
And the original edition is by an American. Right?
The amazing thing that I read in reading this, about this, in this, I'm reading a wonderful biography, and of course I've read Christopher Hitchens, who for some reason just adored Thomas Paine.
You know, I have not. I should read that one.
Yeah, Christopher Hitchens was I'm deeply enamored of Hitchens. I've got his book, arguably, which is his essays, and if you look at the index, you think, how did one man know all that? It's unbelievable. He loved Paine. He liked Jefferson, but he loved Paine. I'm also reading John Keene's excellent biography, Tom Paine, A Political Life. And one of the things that's so interesting, given the fact that our first book club selection was Joseph Ellis's Founding Family, when Paine finished Common Sense, it was anonymous. There were lots of people who thought Franklin had written it. Mm-hmm. No one was quite sure. Well, then he publishes these 13 essays called the Crisis Papers, one for each of the colonies. And Abigail Adams is reading the Crisis Papers, which are anonymous, and she says in a letter to John, I think this is the same guy who wrote Common Sense. She is one amazing woman. She's reading an anonymous newspaper set of essays, and she recognizes that
his style,
that's got to be the guy who wrote Common Sense.
Right.
Now, John Adams, as usual, David, both admired Paine and detested him. He admired him because, of course, Paine did this great thing. He probably changed the course of human history with his propaganda. He
Wait a minute, say that again.
Yeah, this book I read this twice in this book by John Keene, Tom Paine, A Political Life, and he says Thomas Paine changed the course of human history. And he didn't know it when he wrote Common Sense.
But he kind of declares that in that.
Yeah, but you can declare what you want.
This is the cause of all mankind.
But I could write this and it could be stillborn. He wrote this. He did not know that this was going to become one of the greatest moments in the history of publishing.
Right place, right time.
Who knows? Genius, too. I mean, he had a genius for making the sale, writing the argument, convincing people, lifting you up. Sarcasm, hope, dreams, viciousness, solid argumentation. George Washington said, in praising Common Sense, he said, it's unarguable. His arguments cannot be refuted. His arguments are unarguably good. So he had all these different qualities, plus this plain prose style. Remember, at this time, most people were writing in this artificial Ciceronian way with subordinate clause after subordinate clause. Things like, knowing that humankind has always been given over to vicious vicissitudes and aware that humans try things that don't always work out, and furthermore, and so on, all that stuff. That wasn't Paine. It was noun, verb, noun, noun, direct, simple vocabulary. Didn't want to use any of the rhetorical tools that were associated with Ciceronian English.
And he made people think about government in a way I suspect they did not. Right away in the first section, he talks about he makes this argument about government is a necessary
It's an evil.
And
society is good, government is bad.
Right. and one is for our betterment and one is for our vices.
And John Keane, in this biography, which I'm touting, says that he was the first political thinker in the English language to separate government from society. Previously, government and society had been sort of the same thing, the same cookie. But Paine said, no, society is good. You and I live in a place, I want to build a boat. I can't build it by myself. I come to you and say, David, help me build a boat. You do, then you can't get your harvest.
I was hearing Jefferson's
voice.
I
talk this way all the time as Jefferson.
About how,
build the barn.
One man on an island, another man share the bread.
And so he says, that's good. You and I, if there were 6 of us, we come together and we agree to put up each other's barns and harvest each other's corns.
If there was only one of us, we may perish.
We could perish. So society is inevitable and natural and good. But he says, however, at a certain point, person X is going to spin out of control and try to cheat his neighbors. Now what?
Or even more, at a certain point, we're going to decide we need a leader and we appoint a king.
Right. So we appoint a leader to solve our disputes. So we say, look, no one's minding anyone else's fence lines here. We're going to have to create a government. And he says government is about human frailty. Government is about evil. Government is what you have to do because human nature is not always benevolent. Of course, he's right. And so you create government to be the arbitrator. But he says society is more important than government, and we must always remember that. So that's one of the distinctions that he likes to make. And then he says, all right, so we need a government. How should we do it? And he says, if you were really being rational, the last thing you would do would be to create monarchy. The monarchy is just an inherently stupid idea. You should have a rotating presidency, or you should have a council or a representative system.
He doesn't really say it that simple, but that's the point
he says it's an absurdity. And he says, and you know what people say? They say 2 things about it. They say that it's biblically based, and he says, not so, and proves it. And he says, they say it's stable, not so. And then he points to the Wars of the Roses and James II and Charles I and says, it is a highly unstable system, this monarchy. He traces it back to William the Conqueror and says, how about that? The British love their kingship. It comes from a usurper who came from France in the 11th century, and they're okay with that the French invaded their island and brought in the Norman invasion, 1066 and all that, and they praise this system. The Hanoverian kings date from the Norman conquest, where foreigners occupied and took over your country.
That's a great example of him bringing forth an argument that probably
no one had thought about.
No, especially common folks. And it was a really good point.
And he a tremendous use of sarcasm. I mean, and to say, in our time, you can say anything you want about anybody. But back then, remember Voltaire, same age, criticized the aristocracy of France, and he was beaten up by ruffians who were employed by French aristocrats. I mean, he was publicly beaten in the streets almost to death for saying that aristocracy is flawed. So Paine, when he says that George III is the royal brute of England, he's saying things that are much crazier than they seem today when we are all rude and vulgar.
Right. When you say sarcasm, we think of it in our own terms. But he writes, in England, a king hath little more to do than make war and give away places, which in plain terms is to impoverish the nation and set it together by the ears. So that's his sarcasm, right?
Of course. And he says that, the people praise the British Constitution and say, well, the king is no longer absolute. But he said, we left him the key. We left him the key to absolutism. And he says the fact that he gives out places, he creates jobs, he gives pensions, he creates knights and nobles and gives people cabinet positions, that gives him essentially unlimited power over England.
A pretty business indeed for a man to be allowed 800,000 sterling a year for, and worshipped into the bargain. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived.
Crowned ruffians.
Crowned ruffians.
Say that to George III or Louis XVI.
Well, maybe that's why he was anonymous. What do you think?
But how about this? This is from the first page. How impious is the title of sacred majesty applied to a worm who in the midst of his splendor is crumbling into dust. He calls a monarch is just a worm dying like the rest of us.
And there's that American spirit about, hey, you, the establishment, take this. Really.
But then there's the more inspiring side. So there's the deep, angry, sarcastic, vicious side. But then he says, this is my page 11, the sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now. Now is the seed time of continental union, faith, and honor. The least fracture now will be like a name engraved with the point of a pin on a tender rind of a young oak, and the wound will enlarge with the tree, and posterity read it in full-grown characters.
Love that. I was hoping you did the pin oak and enlarge with it. And all these arguments that he makes using nature as an example of...
Very Jeffersonian in that. And he says of America, the commerce by which he hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life and will always have a market. In other words, the fact that America is this giant resource base means that we're always going to win because the world's going to want our tobacco and our trees and our indigo and our flax, that America is set up in a way that no other nation is. Finland, Sweden, Germany, Britain, they have tiny resource bases and they must trade. But America has that which everybody wants, and so you're always going to be all right, and you don't need Great Britain.
In Section 3, Thoughts on the Present State of American Affairs, he talks about the hostilities between England and the American colonies, but then he gets into some pretty specific suggestions about how a government would work.
Well, so he knows that that people are going to say to him, "Fine, we get it. Monarchy doesn't work. It's absurd."
So what's your idea?
What's your positive idea, right? That's what we always say.
Yeah.
Remember when you're 18 and your teacher in high school would say, "Yeah, David, but what do you want to build? We know what you want to tear down." The way they talked, like, "Yeah, what's your positive thing?" But they say to Paine, "Okay, so what's your?" And he says, "Well, we need a representative democracy. We're too big for democracy, so we'll have representation." He has this ingenious thing that each state is going to put up a presidential candidate and will rotate so that every state will get represented over time. He has a whole series of proposals.
Calls for a Congress made up of at least 390 representatives.
That's
from
a lot.
13 colonies.
Yeah, now we're 535 in the year 2018. He wanted 390 in the year 1775 or 6.
And the Congress would meet annually and elect a president. Each colony would be put into a lottery. The president would be elected by the whole Congress. So he gets pretty detailed about how this could work.
So many people are like Patrick Henry or Samuel Adams. They know how to tear down, but they don't have a positive plan. Paine's saying, "I do. You want to hear the positive plan? Here it is."
But he also says, smarter men than me could refine
And
this.
you know who one of them was? John Adams, because he said, this guy knows, this is so Adams, like, this guy knows nothing about government. He's infantile. I mean, you look at his positive suggestions, they're nuts. Adams just couldn't stand it. He could never stand for anyone to be popular. And he didn't like Paine's popularity, and so he got him in the only place he could, which was that John Adams, had worked out a smarter system for the positive future of our Constitution than Paine had.
I don't believe you, but can you tell me the historical reference for knowing that Adams was jealous of Thomas Paine?
In the letters to Jefferson, he goes on and on about how Paine was overrated.
Really?
Yes. Just look him up in Lester Caplan's edition of the letters of Jefferson and Adams, or go to Passionate Sage and look up Thomas Paine.
Mm-hmm.
Adams, it has to be said, and I know that you're going to object as an Adamsite, but Adams couldn't stand anybody's celebrity. He tried to bring down George Washington's celebrity, Jefferson's celebrity, Franklin's celebrity, Paine's celebrity.
I agree with you. I think it may, in a case of Adams, is not so much he was trying to bring people down as bring himself up, and it was the wrong way
But listen to
do
this.
it. He never thought he got his due.
Listen to this from Common Sense. "O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive. and prepare in time an asylum for mankind.
That's great.
Isn't that great? That's that kind of stirring sermon. You, America, that's what's on the Statue of Liberty. Bring us your tired, your poor. The idea of the American dream that everyone who couldn't get a chance somewhere else in the world might get a chance in America.
Here, right.
We're facing that battle right now on our southern border. Our greatness has been welcoming those who can't find freedom or due process or the rule of law somewhere else. And there are others saying, enough already.
This is great to hear your insight on this, but we need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment to continue our discussion about common sense. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and seated across from me is my friend David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. You suggested common sense. I'm glad you did. And then you read it out loud for our 1776 Club members.
Well, I made an attempt. I listened to you read it and go, you should have done it.
I want to say this about Paine. This was just the beginning. So Common Sense is a famous document that almost nobody reads. He went on to write The Age of Reason, which is about
everybody
deism.
knows about
We
it.
all have heard about it.
Yeah.
He also wrote The Rights of Man and other things, the Crisis Papers and a whole range of things. And in the course of his life, he developed a kind of a plan. And he's really the father of the welfare state. He wants workman's comp. He wants old age pensions. He wants unemployment insurance.
I didn't know
He's
that.
a feminist. I mean, he was viciously anti-slavery. In fact, he came to the attention of Benjamin Rush, the great physician from Philadelphia, because of an anti-slavery article he wrote for the Pennsylvania magazine. And I was making a list of this as I read this book this weekend, and I thought, okay, Benjamin Rush was a principled antagonist of slavery.
Boy, he just pops up everywhere.
Joseph Priestley was a principled antagonist of slavery.
Right.
Hamilton and Adams, Paine. How did Jefferson do this? Like, people that admire him deeply have written about how slavery has no defense, and Jefferson finds a way to convince them that he's okay. That's a lot of very close personal friends who admired him deeply, who found slavery to be an unbelievable blot, and somehow they kind of gave Jefferson a pass. It's a strange phenomenon that he knew so many anti-slavery advocates, and they corresponded about all sorts of things. When they all kind of agreed not to bring up the elephant in the room with Jefferson, it just makes you sad, because you loved Benjamin Rush, you loved Tom Paine, you loved Joseph Priestley, you loved Richard Price, you love Adams, and so on. And all of them thought, if we're going to do a revolution, let's see this thing through, and let's stop that thing, slavery. And Jefferson was like tragically footbound.
Right.
Tragically bound into the world of slavery, and he couldn't wriggle his way out of it. And he somehow made it clear that he was an okay guy.
In your argument, which I agree with, is you also have to look at this other group of men as perhaps enablers.
Because they didn't challenge him.
Well, we don't know, or do we?
Well, once John Adams did. We've talked about this. And late in their correspondence, Adams, this is during the Missouri Compromise of 1819 and 20, and Adams says, look, all this time I've known you. I've never brought this up. I don't really want to bring it up now. I trust you in Washington and Madison and Monroe. You're good men. I've always thought you would have to figure out a way out of this, and it's not for me, in New England. But he says, but the Missouri Compromise makes me dream at night of apocalyptic armies of black people and white people. And he said, it's sort of, we're going to have to talk about this. And he says, that's all I want to say. And then he says, but I shouldn't maybe even have brought it up because I trust you. I know, I believe in you. And then Jefferson, of course, doesn't respond because he doesn't have a response.
Yeah, how could he?
Doesn't have a response.
Right.
But it's the only time that Adams ever said to him, what? I mean, you're Jefferson. You're bigger than this. You're the last person who should be defending slavery by omission or inaction. So you're saying they enabled him. They did to a certain degree because they understood.
I was asking if you thought they did.
I do think they did because they knew that you can't win this argument. They knew that, look, I mean, this is how I see it too. Thomas Jefferson is this Renaissance man. He's gifted in everything he does. He's the most elegant writer. perfect penmanship. He's a universal genius. He's like, in some ways, the greatest American. There is this really severe problem, but that's not enough to discredit him. There's so much that's great about him. We won't bring that up much because there's nowhere to go with it anyway.
Well, obviously there are those who think it is enough to discredit him, but you're talking about his time.
friends, and they made a bargain, and their bargain was, there's so much that is admirable about this man. He's been so important to our cause, to this world, that we have to somehow not get stuck there. It's not that we agree with him or give him a pass, but we're not going to get stuck there because he's so very, very admirable in so many other ways. Today, it's just the reverse. As you know, there are people who say, I don't give a darn whether he knew ancient Greek or could build a nice edifice. He was a slaveholder. And so we get letters about this. I get that. But in his own time, there was a kind of a tacit, unspoken bargain that there's no point in going after Jefferson on slavery because there's nowhere to go with it.
A couple things. One is it's agreed that without Thomas Paine's common sense, the revolution may not have occurred. John Adams said, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain.
So this is about the power of language.
Right.
Did you see the new Churchill film?
Yes.
Where the last line by his enemy, his sworn enemy, is, oh my, he's marshaled the English language into the war.
Right.
That's Jefferson and Tom Paine.
Yeah.
George Washington
that's a
couldn't
great
do
comparison.
it. James Madison couldn't do it. I mean, there are a handful of people who have this capacity with language. Jefferson had it. Paine had it. Madison didn't. Monroe didn't. John Adams didn't. George Washington didn't. But there are a handful of people who somehow bring to bear a certain way of communicating at a certain moment with a certain persona, and it clicks into place, and it's like nuclear detonation. What happens goes viral and changes the world.
Paine ends this argument in the book. What he does is he lays all this stuff out. He's got the reasons of nature and God and against kings and monarchy and how we could put this whole plan into place. And then in the end, he says, and oh, by the way, America, you are the strongest and best and most able to create this form of government that'll last through the ages, and here's why. And he does it through the idea of why America is so capable of creating its own Navy. And I just think I thought that was brilliant. You're nodding your head.
Yeah, well, first of all, he has three arguments, really. One is that we can be Fortress America.
Right.
Because we're 3,000 miles from them.
Right.
Number two, we have the resource base that no other nation in human history has ever had, and so we're set. We're going to be fine.
And he gets into details about how, the Dutch can't do this. They can build the ships, but they need our raw materials. And, oh, by the way, if we build these ships, we can get their gold and silver, and that's a good thing. I mean, it's a great argument.
The third thing is that he's anticipating Alfred Thayer Mann's view that the influence of sea power on history, that the nation that controls the seas controls the world. That changed the life of Theodore Roosevelt. But he's saying, you have the timber to build a navy that Britain can't build. They don't have the timber. You will be the hegemon if you wish to be. And he says it has to be now, because if you don't do it now, where's your self-respect? It's like what you say to someone, a battered spouse, when you say, you got to just do it. You just got to move into the shelter. You're enabling if you stay. And he's basically saying, America, if you stay with Britain and try to work it out, you're enabling more abuse. You just have to do it. You have to take the moment to have the moral courage to do the thing you're going to have to do. And by the way, it's coming no matter what you say. But if you don't do it now, it's shame on you, because look, they're mowing you down in the streets, guys.
Great
they're burning
discussion.
your houses down.
Great discussion. I've learned so much from you this week. I thank you.
Well, you're the one who voiced it. I want to hear it. I had to read it. If I could have listened to you while being out in the garden.
Well, let's not pitch it too much.
Oh, come on.
You
have to be a
Jefferson
you have to be a 1776 Club member to hear this.
That's right. Go to Jefferson.
In other words, if you want to hear Swenson, read. By the way, do you know Christopher Hitchens?
Yeah, no.
You got to read his books.
Yeah.
For some reason, he adored Tom Paine.
Oh, I've read Hitchens, but
Right.
not this one.
So I'm gonna leave this with you. This is
bless your heart. Thank
Christopher Hitchens, the author of the #1 bestseller, God is Not Great.
Anyway,
this is Thomas Paine's
trying
The Rights
to
of Man.
compliment you on.
What an interesting story,
yes.
Thomas Paine. Our next book, The Histories of Tacitus.
Can we wait till after gardening?
Okay, but what's the next book? Because we have to do one.
Well, we'll talk about it.
All
But
right.
right now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
When Thomas Paine died in June 1809, he was buried on his farm in New Rochelle, New York. The farm had been awarded to him by the state of New York for his work on behalf of American independence. Paine was not much of a farmer, but he was glad to have a piece of property from which he could derive some income and a refuge from the press of urban life and the persecutions of his many enemies. He had a lot of enemies. Most American people then were pious and righteous, and Paine was wrongly considered a filthy atheist. He was not an atheist. Like his steady friend Thomas Jefferson, Paine was a deist. That is, he believed in a God-ordered universe, but had significant doubts about the divinity of Jesus, the miracles, the Trinity, and the apocalyptic matter in the New Testament. Jefferson wisely kept such thoughts mostly to himself. Paine published The Age of Reason in 1794 and 1796, and it may be said that his reputation in the United States never recovered. Two things are important to note about this. First, The Age of Reason was not an atheistic or impious book, though of course one's enemies invariably use whatever club they can find or fabricate to damage those with whom they disagree. Second, and more important, Paine wrote The Age of Reason in a filthy death row prison cell in France. Think of that, The Age of Reason on death row. He was jailed by the Marat Robespierre faction of the French Revolution for being too moderate and humane. He famously pled for the lives of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette against those who wished to cut their heads off. That Paine was not himself beheaded during the Reign of Terror would be regarded as nearly miraculous, but of course both Paine and Jefferson would have declined to see his survival in such God-active terms. Jefferson's refusal to join the chorus of American leaders who denounced Paine was politically costly to him, more controversial than most things Jefferson did in his public life. When Paine was finally ready to return to the United States in 1802, Jefferson offered to bring him to his adopted home country in a public sailing vessel. This did not actually happen, but Paine haters denounced Jefferson for almost ferrying an infidel and a vulgarian from France to the United States. Then Paine stayed with Jefferson for a short time in the White House, about a month, and this, as you might expect, drove the most vicious element in American life insane. Sound familiar? But what interests me today, in the early summer of 2018, are two ironies. First, Paine's great book, Common Sense, which was for the American Revolution what President Lincoln said Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was for the Civil War, was a stunning success because it was written in plain, straightforward, unadorned, simple, and racy prose. In fact, Paine wanted to call it Plain Truth, but his new friend Benjamin Rush suggested that it might better be called Common Sense. I read Common Sense for the first time in many years last weekend. I wish every American would take time to read it this week after you hear this. It is available in all sorts of free online formats and now for 1776 Club members in David Swenson's voice. But here's the great irony. I expect that many who start it will put it down because they find it too difficult to read, too difficult to follow the argument. Think about that for a moment. We have dumbed down our national cultural literacy to the point that a book written so that every American of its time could read it and grasp its meaning is now probably too difficult for the mass of people that Paine sought to reach and persuade. If this is true, if I'm right about this, we are in very, very deep trouble as a nation. A self-governing people can only govern itself sensibly if it understands what's at stake. When America became a mostly materialistic society, a stuff and entertainment delivery engine, we lost any chance to be the world's most remarkable republic. The establishment, by which I mean the institutional culture of government, church, educational institutions, foundations, nonprofits, the media, museums, galleries, and libraries, the establishment is the part of America that still believes in the program of the Enlightenment. It is very far from perfect, the deep state. We all know that. But it should be reformed not destroyed. And we all know, even its torchbearers know, that a kind of cultural nihilism is at the heart of the Trump revolution. This will sound simplistic, but a people who can no longer read common sense can no longer serve as a shining lamp to the world. Here's the second irony. After Paine's death, an admiring journalist and political radical named William Cobbett decided that a citizen of the world like Paine should not be buried on an obscure farmstead in rural New York. So he exhumed the body and took it to Britain to be buried in some more honorable way at some location where Paine admirers could make a pilgrimage to visit the grave of one of the most important rights advocates of the modern world. But for reasons that cannot now be sorted out, Cobbett never accomplished his goal, and if you can imagine it, Thomas Paine's bones were lost and never rediscovered. All you can say is, how can this be? That Thomas Paine's bones were tampered with for seemingly admirable reasons, and then lost. I have a little experience along those lines, not worth mentioning here, but it has seemed to me all of my life, and especially since 9/11, that archaeology is a fundamentally problematic business. If you could find an X-ray machine that would show us where all the unexhumed Greek, Persian, and Chinese statues are buried, the Mycenaean jewelry and the gold death masks, the votive objects, the effigies and vases and headdresses deep in the earth, where corrosive oxygen cannot get at them, your instinct would be to dig them up, conserve them, and place them in museums. But the minute something is yanked up and into the world, into the air, into the uncertainty, greed, theft, and vandalism of the world, its sanctity and security become eroded. When Pompeii was excavated, the archaeologists found magnificent frescoes on the walls of the Roman city shops, homes, and taverns. Many of those priceless treasures are now lost because oxygen went to work on them for the first time since 79 AD. In some ironic sense, the safest place to leave a classical Greek amphora or vase, or the bones of Sacagawea for that matter, is where they were buried, either deliberately or by the wrecker-builder Earth. If Al-Qaeda hit the Library of Congress with the bomb, or the National Archives, or the Smithsonian, the Louvre, the British Museum, or the Chicago Art Institute, we would lose many of the world's greatest treasures in an instant. But 40 feet beneath Crete or Jerusalem, whatever is there is safe until someone with a backhoe or a toothbrush starts nosing around. If Cobbett had just left Tom Paine's bones on the farm in New Rochelle where they belonged, thousands of pilgrims would make their way to New Rochelle every year to pay their respects to one of the great men of the Enlightenment, one of the few individuals who can accurately be said to have changed the world. Indeed, New Rochelle would be blessed with all sorts of tourism possibilities, including, no doubt, a Tom Paine interpretive center. But Cobbett wanted more for Paine and wound up giving him less. We think we are the enlightened ones, don't we? But we are human, all too human. And American troops stood by during the Second Gulf War and watched as the Iraqi National Museum was looted by the poor, the greedy, and the nihilists. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.